morning. On behalf of my colleagues at the Federal Trade Commission, I'm happy to welcome you.
And then it provides an explanation to the user. This now can former explain can link directly information about this training data via explanations. The eyebrows
Sorry about that.
To determine the mood according to the explanation method. You also see that there's a lot of flickering, so these explanation methods are far from perfect at the moment. On more traditional, like tabular data, an explanation method might look like on the right, where let's assume we want to predict whether or not a person gets a loan, and an explanation might say, okay, you would have gotten the loan if your income would be higher. To say, look, the income was the most important feature. If you want to have a theoretical intuition for how these explanations work, the gradient of the loss with respect to the input is like the canonical example, because the gradient tells you how the output changes when you change the input. So on the next slide, you see kind of the results from our attack. Similar to Hongyan, I'm not going into detail about how the attack works. If you're interested, you find it in the paper. But we demonstrated on a conceptual level on several data sets. Here I've shown customer shopping data and the hospital data, that an adversary with access to the explanations can figure out whether or not a point was used for training, and he can do this far better than random guessing. So on the final slide, let me conclude. What should you take away from my talk? First, we have demonstrated that model explanations can leak membership information. And the overall goal seems to be that we want trustworthy machine learning. And the white papers out there often say, okay, we need privacy and we need interpretability for trustworthy machine learning to work. And academia has reacted, and there are lots of explanation frameworks out there, and new ones are proposed every week, I want to say. So it's very likely that there will be user-facing explainable machine learning frameworks in the future. Right now, the big companies that give kind of programs to programmers already include explainability tools in their frameworks. So I hope that both developers and regulators have the privacy implications in mind when they are designing explanation methods. If you have questions that go beyond the kernel, you can reach me at the email address, and the link to the paper is on the bottom of the slide.
Thank you very much, Martin, and again to all our other panelists for those very informative presentations. I'm really looking to hearing more about them in our discussion portion, which we will now move on to now. I really hope to engage in some great discussion and expanding upon some of the research that you've presented and the implications of such in the work that we all do. So first, I just sort of wanted to say and kind of ask a question to you, Basi. I mean, research has shown the prevalence of bias, including unintended discriminatory outcomes in machine learning algorithms used for various purposes. We've seen this from healthcare to credit to targeted or behavioral advertising decisions, as your paper showed. And algorithmic fairness legislation has been proposed in the US and abroad to help mitigate such bias. Such legislation often calls for more transparency and auditing of algorithms. So sort of to you first, Basi, in light of your research, it seems that you might agree that increased transparency might be useful in achieving fairness in algorithms for online job advertisements. From your technical point of view, I'd be interested in hearing what implications does your research have on such legislation? What would you recommend to increase algorithmic transparency, including in job delivery algorithms?
That's a great question. Yes, transparency is one of the things that we call for in our work, and that can come in different forms. one of the things that we recommend in our work is that our platforms need to provide additional data and statistics about not just about like how ads are delivered, but also what happens at the ad targeting phase and also at the ad auction phase. For example, in LinkedIn's case, the platform does not provide a breakdown of ad delivery by gender, so we had to rely on a workaround methodology. To audit how the ads are delivered by gender. So, for example, one way LinkedIn can provide a breakdown of ad delivery by sensitive attributes. In Facebook's case, there are some existing transparency efforts, such as a public ad library API that they made available, which is a good first step, but we don't think it's enough. There is like I said, like the target advertising pipeline is a complex process with many steps. Currently, they provide breakdown by of like ad delivery, but providing additional statistics about other parts of the pipeline would be useful. And want to add one more point, another transparency direction that we're thinking about, and we hope our platforms would consider, is providing auditing interface that auditors can use to query different parts of their algorithms to certify their fairness. So that's one direction we're exploring as well.
Thank you. To follow on that, Hongyan and Martin, similar issue. I mean, both of your papers seem to suggest that there may be trade-offs between privacy and algorithmic fairness, or methods aimed to achieve fairness, such as explainability or other auditing methods. In light of the findings of your research, what implications does your research have on transparency legislation or auditing legislation? Do you think there are ways to achieve algorithmic fairness and protect the privacy of underrepresented communities at the same time, or do you think there might be some inherent trade-offs between privacy and fairness, or auditing methods to achieve fairness?
I think this is a very interesting question, and the short answer to that is that actually we can achieve fairness and privacy at the same time. So for example, if we have a constant classifier that always outputs the same label for all the data points, then the model will be fair, but because it always gives the same output to all the data points within different groups. And the model is also privacy preserving because the model is independent of the data. But I think more importantly, can we achieve fairness and privacy without hurting accuracy of the model? And unfortunately, some theoretical works show that differential privacy can conflict with many group fairness notions, including equalized odds. So the results show that if the learning algorithm is satisfy pure differential privacy, which is very strict differential privacy notion, then the fair models outputted by this algorithm is a constant classifier. So in other words, if we want to achieve pure differential privacy, group fairness, then the model accuracy we can get is no greater than that of a constant classifier. So when we talk about achieve fairness and privacy at the same time, I think probably the first thing we need to do is relax our privacy notion. For instance, some existing work actually show that relax this privacy requirement and study the differentially private fair algorithm with respect to approximate DP, which is a more relaxed version. And their empirical results shows that DP, a differentially private algorithm, can output a model that achieves good accuracy and fairness at the same time. So I personally think quite optimistic. I believe that accuracy, approximate fairness, and approximate differential privacy can be achieved at the same time, but it needs further effort from the research communities.
Thank you. Martin, do you have any thoughts on that?
On the positive note, so I currently I don't think there's an inherent trade-off between explainability and privacy. And this is if you care about the privacy of the training data, and you want to explain the model, the only thing you kind of need to guarantee is that your model is private. So if you can guarantee a private model and you explain only interacts with this model, you would have a private explanation. So this is a good note. On the bad side, in our work, we actually found some hints that the privacy risk for minorities might actually be higher than for the majority class. So the privacy risk through explanations from minorities might be higher than majorities, and it's kind of problematic because it's kind of exactly the people you want the explanation for, because they are most likely to be the ones who are discriminated. So that's the bad part. And the other part, bad news, in a follow-up work to mine, there's actually some indication that it's harder to explain private models. So how do you make a model private? You introduce noise. And this noise kind of is on a very wishy-washy level, it's counterintuitive. So if you introduce noise, it makes the model more complicated, and now it's harder to understand. So yeah, I don't think there's a fundamental trade-off, but there's still work to do to figure it out.
Thank you for that. Going back to you, Basi, your paper demonstrates a method for algorithmic auditing, specifically for gender discrimination in job advertisement ad delivery, when platforms aren't transparent about their algorithms. Do you think similar methods could be used to audit for other forms of discrimination, such as race or sexual orientation, or could they be used for other machine learning algorithms, such as those used to serve ads for other types of things, such as credit or housing, or even algorithms that are used to assist in credit or housing decisions? And if so, do you think there'd be any limitations for using such methods?
That's a great question. The short answer is yes. We'll be able to extend this methodology.
And I think, did Basi freeze? Okay, we'll maybe go to the next question, and hopefully we can hear from him on that, because I'd really be interested.
Am I back?
Yes, you're back. You froze for a minute.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we use the voter data from North Carolina to create an audience where we know both the gender and the location, because LinkedIn provides breakdown by location, and we use that as a proxy to calculate the gender breakdown. Similarly, the data set also includes other fields like race and age. So we would be able to use those to audit for discrimination by race and age. But the caveat is that, like I mentioned in the talk, we would need to find a pair of job positions with similar qualification requirements, but there's an imbalance by race or age or other sensitive attributes that we're interested in. And in response to your question about the limitation, one of the main limitations that we talk about in the paper comes from using location as a proxy to calculate gender, because, for example, people might move from between different locations, or the data might be outdated. So there's some error that comes from that, and also another limitation is just the cost involved in running this ad. When we run our experiments on multiple audiences and also different job categories to gain confidence in our results, and the cost can easily add up if we want to gain more confidence in our results. So yeah, there are those caveats, but yes, our method can be extended.
Thank you. Hong-An, your paper covers one scenario where fairness can conflict with privacy, specifically group fairness, as you were discussing earlier on equalized odds. Are there other ways that you think privacy and fairness can conflict in machine learning algorithms that you haven't already discussed?
Yes, thanks for the question. I think fairness and privacy could conflict with each other in other scenarios. One scenario that draws a lot of attention is when we care about the privacy with respect to the sensitive attribute, such as race, gender. For example, GDPR restricts the racial data collection from customers. So it protects the privacy with respect to the sensitive attribute, but actually it raises a big issue for training a fair model. Because researchers have found that fairness can only be achieved through awareness. So for example, if you want to build a gender fair classifier and you exclude the gender attribute, it does not guarantee to provide fairness, and it will hurt the accuracy of the model. So it is because that there are many other features that are well correlated with your gender. For instance, we can make a good guess about individuals' gender by knowing their favorite songs and favorite colors. So in this case, the gender blend model may discriminate against the males or females by discriminating against the people who like a particular song. So this allowing the collection of the sensitive attributes for protecting privacy indeed raises a problem for fairness. And another important scenario is when privacy is achieved by adding the noise to individuals' data. So the model can only see the noisy version of the individual's data. Actually, in this case, some researchers also found that the resource allocation decisions made on this noisy data can disproportionately affect some subgroups. So overall, there are a lot of ways privacy can conflict with fairness in machine learning tasks. So basically, it tells us that when we ask for privacy and fairness, we really need to think about both of them at the same time because they can really affect each other.
Thank you. Martin, going to you, your paper focuses on the privacy aspects of data, specifically stakeholders and the deployment of machine learning model explanation tools. Are there other stakeholders, including those, for example, involved in the design or development of machine learning? Or model explanation tools that you think might see their privacy eroded?
Thanks for the question. So I hinted at this in the talk a little bit. So I think the biggest hurdle for explanations is not so much the privacy of the data, it's the privacy of the model and the fact that whoever creates the model wants to keep it private. So there's already research out there that demonstrates if you just see enough predictions of a model, you can reproduce it. And if you explain these predictions, it just becomes easier to reproduce the model. So I think that the companies might have an interest in not releasing explanations because it makes it easier to kind of extract the models. And then just like copy the models. So this is kind of the one big stakeholder that might see their privacy affected.
I kind of want to go back to sort of like you, Hong-An, were saying, and also Martin, sort of about the collection of data and maybe the collection of sensitive attributes versus when you might have data with added noise. And I know there's been some technology experts who advocate for the need to have more collection of data. And so you need more information on protected characteristics of underrepresented communities and things like that, while others might suggest that it's possible to mitigate algorithmic bias without collecting demographic or proxy data such as using simulated data or data where you've added in noise. In your view, which approach, if any, and this is really a question for all of our panelists, would you recommend? And do you think that there are any privacy risks of the approach that you would recommend?
Thanks for the question. I think this is a very interesting question. So first of all, I would like to mention that the inherent trade-off between privacy and fairness I mentioned before holds when we have infinite number of samples. So there is an inherent trade-off between privacy and fairness, even we have a limited number of samples. But in practice, what we often observe is that if we have more data from the distribution, then the privacy risk will be reduced. In fact, in our paper, we analyzed the effect of more data collection on the trade-off between privacy and fairness. Actually, we show that when there are more data from the underrepresented group, the data set is more balanced. Then in this case, the standard model is also less biased. As a consequence, the privacy cost of achieving fairness is also reduced. So in other words, more data collection from the underrepresented group can help to reduce the cost of achieving fairness. And another thing you talk about is the simulated data. I think it's a very interesting question because to use this kind of techniques, we must make sure that this simulated data is privacy preserving. Because usually we learn this simulated data based on some private data set. So this simulated data may contain sensitive information about the original data set. So if we want to use this kind of techniques, we must make sure that the individual information won't be leaked through this simulated data. And another property is that we want to make sure that any fairness guarantee a model provides on this simulated data should also hold approximately on the original data set or on the distribution we care about. So a simulated data satisfy these two requirements could be a very interesting thing we should look at. In my opinion, this is a good research direction we should definitely look at.
I'll be looking forward to that research you'll do on it. Martin or Basi, do you have any responses?
Yeah. I want to add something to the Hongyan's wish list for the simulated data. So, like explanations often only work in the context, so they need access to the data to kind of have a context and then explain it in the context. In different context, like you might need different explanations. And now, if you only have like simulated data, your explanation, I mean, to be privacy preserving, should be on the simulated data, and this is slightly a different context than the original data. So you need to kind of ensure that the explanations you gain the simulated data are actually like useful in the real world where you then are based on real data. So I want to add this to the list of Hongyan's criteria. It should not just be privacy preserving and fair, it should also be like explainable, ideally.
And I know we only have a few minutes left, and I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that, Basi, or I would really be interested in hearing from all of our panelists in our last few minutes if you had any thoughts on how you think policy makers or law enforcement agencies like the FTC can help mitigate algorithmic bias and ad delivery algorithms used by platforms or any other machine learning tools while protecting consumers' privacy interests. So I don't know who would like to begin. How about you, Basi?
I can start, yeah. So like I mentioned in the talk, the technical evidence that we shows that the role ad platforms play in ad delivery is significant, and that regulations and policies should take that into account. I think a good first step would be for technical, legal, and policy experts to be in the same room and look at the technical evidence from both our work and other prior audit findings to see whether those technical audits or the findings are enough to inform or enact new policies? And if that's not the case, what additional technical contributions would be useful, to inform like future policies? That's our recommendation.
Anyone else in the last few seconds? We have about a minute.
Okay. So the worst case I see would be if people look at our work and say, oh, this transparency has privacy implications, so we shut down and have less transparency. So I actually think we should have more work like Bazi's. And I think the FTC can help because it can regulate who has access to these transparency tools, and if auditors have access and trusted auditors have access, I think there's little privacy risk. The privacy risk comes from everybody having access. So if you kind of can ensure that the right people get access and more people like Bazi have access, that would be good.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, this has been a very interesting discussion. I want to thank again all of our panelists for their amazing presentations in this awesome discussion. We really hope everyone will stick around, as next we're fortunate to have another presentation on auditing machine learning algorithms for bias. So thank you again to all of our panelists, and I appreciate everyone for sticking around.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Lerone Banks, and I'm a computer scientist at the FTC. It is my pleasure to introduce Ziad Obermeyer from UC Berkeley. Ziad will be presenting work his team has done to identify algorithmic bias in healthcare and practical steps that organizations can take to identify bias in their own applications. Please send your questions via Twitter or email at privacycon@ftc.gov, and we'll get to them after the talk. With that, please give your attention to Ziad Obermeyer.
Thank you so much, Liron. So I'm going to talk a little bit about work that with my co-authors and the rest of my team, we've been doing to try to diagnose and fix algorithmic bias over the past couple of years. So I'm going to start by walking through a case study very quickly, and then transition into some of the practical steps that I think we've learned can be really, really effective for this goal of fixing algorithmic bias. I'm going to try to wrap that up in about 15 minutes, mostly because I really like chatting with Liron, and I always learn a lot from him about the links between algorithmic bias regulation and privacy regulation. So let's start by working through a really quick case study on what algorithmic bias looks like. I think for me, this is an example I learned a lot from. This comes from a paper we published 2 years ago in Science, and it works through a case study in health of health systems that are trying to target extra help to patients who need it. So all throughout our health system, there are these pockets of complex, chronically ill patients. And those patients are having a very bad experience with their care. They're experiencing a lot of exacerbations of chronic conditions, and they're also generating high costs for our healthcare system. And so throughout the healthcare world, health systems have invested in what's called high-risk care management. And I think of that as just kind of an extra help program for these very sick patients. So this is a resource that's scarce and that health systems have to distribute to people who need it most. That's like, home visits and primary care slots and a lot of extra help that itself costs money. So we're trying to find people to help so that we can prevent their healthcare problems, so that we can save the healthcare system money. But doing that is actually a scarce resource on its own. And so we really need to target that resource to the people who need it most. And that's where algorithms come in. So algorithms have gotten to a huge, huge scale in health that at least surprised me when I first learned about it. We studied a particular piece of software that itself was used to screen about 70 million people a year at health systems throughout the US. If you look at the family of algorithms that work just like the one we studied, those are being used for 150 to 200 million people a year. So the majority of the US population. And so when we think about the scale that algorithms have reached in society at large, I think health is one of those places where they've just started impacting lives at very, very large scale. So as I mentioned, all these algorithms are trying to find people who are going to get sick. And the way they do that is they predict. So algorithms are really good at looking into the future. And just like algorithms can figure out what product you're going to buy, what movie you're going to like, these algorithms look ahead and figure out how much someone is going to cost the healthcare system by showing up in the ER and getting hospitalized. They make that forecast, and then they figure out, okay, this person looks like she's going to cost a lot of money with all these ER visits and healthcare that she's going to consume. Let's target her with extra help now. So given how widely used these algorithms are, we were really interested in this important question of whether or not they were racially biased. Now, to study racial bias in an algorithm, you really need to define exactly what you mean by bias. And so here's how we did it. We articulated a principle of what an unbiased algorithm would look like. So the way these algorithms work at all these health systems, the one we studied, the ones we've worked with since then, is that it trawls through a population of patients. So if you're working at a hospital or an insurer, you've got a population of patients you're responsible for. And once or twice a year, that algorithm is going to generate a score. And then that score is going to determine if you get prioritized for extra help or whether you get screened out. So people with the same score are going to be treated the same way. And as a result, what we thought was those people should have the same needs in terms of their need for extra help. And the color of their skin definitely shouldn't matter. But that's not what we found. So I'm going to show you a graph and just try to walk through the axes very carefully, because this turns out to be a very general test for bias in an algorithm. So on the x-axis of this graph, on that horizontal axis, we've ranked patients from low to high risk. And so the top 2 or 3%, all the way on the purple side of that graph, and that the last little bit on the right, those are the people who are going to get fast-tracked into this extra help program. On the y-axis, I'm showing you, so the x-axis is what the algorithm thinks is going to happen in terms of your health. On the y-axis, I'm showing you what actually happened in terms of these patients' health. For anyone on the x-axis, this is what goes on to happen. This is how many chronic conditions do you have that flare up over the course of that next year? And you can see that there are two lines there. The top line, the purple line, is Black patients, and the yellow line is white patients. And what you can see is that no matter where we are on that graph, the Black patients line is above the white patients line, which means that they go on to have worse health. So at that same algorithm score, no matter where you look, Black patients go on to have worse health than white patients, even though they're being treated the same and they have the same priority for getting extra help. So how much bias are we talking about here? It's a little hard to tell from the graph, so let me give you some numbers. When we looked at that program, that extra help program that people get prioritized in by the algorithm, it's 18% Black today. Now, you could look at that and think, okay, well, what's the population rate of Black patients that this high priority group is drawn from? And that's actually only 12% Black. So at first glance, you might look at that and say, oh, Black patients are 50% overrepresented in that group. The algorithm can't be biased. It's overrepresenting Black people in this group. When we did a simulation, though, to figure out what that group should have looked like, what proportion of Black patients should have been in that high priority group, it actually should have been 47% Black. So it's an enormous amount of bias that reduced the fraction of Black patients in that program from 47% to 18%. So in the next slide, I'm going to show you another graph. And this graph shows you an important aspect of why the algorithm was going wrong. So we wanted to understand how this happened and how that bias got into the algorithm. And one clue to that is where the algorithm was going right. So on this graph, again, on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, people are ranked by their algorithm score. But now on the y-axis, instead of showing you what happened to their health, I'm showing you what happened to their costs. And you can see that those two lines are right on top of each other. So when the algorithm predicts a certain score, those people go on to have the same costs, even though on the last graph I showed you, they didn't have the same health. So the algorithm is predicting total healthcare costs very accurately and without much bias between Black and white patients. So let me summarize this on the next slide. The algorithm is biased for predicting health, but it's unbiased for predicting cost. And that's because Black and white patients don't have the same relationship between health and costs. White patients have better access to the healthcare system. So when they get sick, they're more likely to go see a doctor. They're not going to stay at home. They're going to see a doctor. They're going to generate more costs, even though they have the same needs. When you have a squeezing sensation in your chest and you're sitting on your couch, you're more likely to call the ambulance, get tested for a heart attack if you're white than if you're Black. In addition, the healthcare system just treats Black patients differently. There's lots of evidence of systemic racism and how doctors actually recommend tests and treatments for Black patients. So the result of all of this is that conditional on someone's health, two people with the same health are going to have different costs if they're Black versus if they're white. And that means that predicting cost accurately means bias when you're predicting health. So let me try to distill some lessons from that case study before stepping back and teasing out the implications. A really important part of what we did is to articulate that ideal target for the algorithm. What should the algorithm be doing? In this case, the algorithm is being used to decide who gets what in terms of extra help for someone's health. And so those people at a given algorithm score, the algorithm should be predicting health, and those people should have the same health needs. That's how you hold an algorithm accountable, by articulating what the target is that it's supposed to be predicting, in this case health, and comparing it, in this case, to what it's actually predicting, which is cost. That difference, even though it's subtle, is the source of a lot of algorithmic bias that we've found in our work. And at the same time, when we detect that bias, we have a roadmap for fixing it. So once we articulated this problem and we realized that the algorithm was predicting the wrong variable, we were able to work with the company that made that algorithm to retrain it to predict health rather than cost. And that really helped, and it reduced the bias in that algorithm by one measure by 84%. That lesson, that we have to articulate the ideal target, hold the algorithm accountable for that, and then make sure the algorithm is doing what it's supposed to do, is a theme that's come up again and again over the past 2 years as we've worked with a lot of healthcare systems, insurers, tech companies, and regulators at the state and federal level. And on the next slide, I just want to give you a sense of some of that work, which is that we've found that this same bias, this discrepancy between what an algorithm is ideally supposed to be doing and what it's actually doing, is very, very widespread throughout the healthcare system. So the top row shows you the algorithm that I just talked about, healthcare needs versus total costs. When we look at a number of other things, for example, on the second to last row, a lot of healthcare systems are using algorithms to figure out, oh, I booked a patient for an appointment with her doctor. Is she going to show up for that appointment? And if that algorithm predicts you're not going to show up, it's going to take that slot away from you and reassign it to some other patient. But of course, people can not show up to their doctor for a couple of reasons. One is that they decide they didn't need care after all. Their runny nose went away, their knee pain got better. But some people don't show up because they face barriers to accessing care. And for that second group of patients who are more likely to be Black and more likely to be poor, the last thing you want to do is reassign that slot to another patient. You want to reach out to that patient and help them, not rebook their slot to someone who needs it less. And so these kinds of biases are active throughout the healthcare system. If you think about it, they're also very active in a lot of other industries. So in criminal justice, a lot of algorithms are trying to predict someone's innate tendency to commit a crime. But we don't see their innate tendency to commit a crime. We see whether or not they get arrested, whether or not they get convicted. And those two are not the same, especially if you look at those two through the lens of race. In finance, we're often interested in predicting creditworthiness. But what is creditworthiness? Instead, we often predict income. And that is also not the same, especially when seen through the lens of gender, race, or socioeconomics. So on the next slide, I try to take some lessons away for detecting bias. And when we're thinking about how to regulate this, whether we're a regulator or whether we're companies or actors that are being regulated, it's very different to work with algorithms than a lot of other things. So when we're regulating a drug, we understand that a drug should do more good than harm. And even though we can disagree about how much good or how much harm, that is the standard that we hold drugs to. When we're regulating a toaster or other appliances, the standard is it shouldn't catch on fire. But what about algorithms? How do we, what vocabulary do we use for regulating them? And what I'd submit to you is that the goalposts, the target that we want to hold algorithms accountable to is that ideal target the algorithm should be predicting. Is the algorithm doing what it's supposed to do? And is it doing equally well for Black and white patients? That's the intuition behind a lot of our work, and it's the intuition that yields a very crisp test for statistical bias, which is, does the algorithm's ability to predict that ideal target differ for Black or white patients? And if it's useful, we can get into this in the discussion, but that has a clear parallel to civil rights law and the use of proxy variables, which can be discriminatory. So I want to close by taking some concrete lessons about what your organization can do to mitigate algorithmic bias. As I mentioned, over the past couple of years, we've been working with a lot of organizations in health, but increasingly outside of health and in finance and other sectors as well. And here are some 4 steps that we've found can be taken within organizations that can really help when dealing with algorithmic bias. The first step is to designate someone in the organization that is responsible for oversight of algorithms. And importantly, that person needs to be at a high level. Very often, decisions about algorithms are pushed down to technical staff and organizations who aren't empowered to make these high-level strategic decisions or to engage in oversight activities about how algorithms are being used. So much like in other parts of regulation and law, we need someone at a high level at an organization who's ultimately responsible for oversight. And that person needs to be advised by a diverse group of people, both inside and outside the organization, who are impacted by algorithms and who are empowered to raise issues and ask questions. Number 2, one thing we found is that most organizations actually don't know what algorithms are being used inside of their own organizations. And I think that's really surprising because let's say you were an executive who hypothetically didn't care at all about racial bias. You would still want to know, given the enormous strategic importance of algorithms that are being used in your organization, what's going on? What are they doing? What are they supposed to be doing? That inventory needs to be maintained and updated regularly so that anyone can start asking questions about what algorithms are doing and how they're performing for that task. Number 3, algorithm performance needs to be documented. It's really surprising how often we've found that when we ask about an algorithm, whether it's in the course of health helping a hospital or a health system do better, or in the course of a civil investigation. Organizations and the staff that are at those organizations have no idea where the algorithm came from, what it does, how it's performing. They often say, oh yeah, Bob made that. And Bob left a couple of years ago, but we're still using that algorithm. And that is a really dangerous situation to be in, both, again, for strategic purposes and for bias purposes. Finally, when algorithms are found to be biased, they need to be either fixed or deleted. So let me just try to articulate some use cases for these lessons. I think if you're a strategic leader at a high level in an organization, you need to know what algorithms are operating at scale in your organization, and you need to think strategically about how those algorithms are being used, where they can go wrong, and what oversight mechanisms you can put in place. If you're part of a technical team, you need to be able to recognize and avoid the subtle technical choices that we've found can lead to bias. And if you're buying algorithms, you need to be an educated consumer of those algorithms you're buying. If you're making policy or regulating algorithms, you need to have clear standards for what algorithmic bias looks like, both so that you can conduct investigations and also so that you can provide guidance to industry on how to stay on the right side of the law. The last thing I'll mention is that we tried to distill all of these practical lessons into what we're calling an algorithmic bias playbook. So the link to this playbook should be in the accompanying material on the Privacycon website. It's free to download and use, and you'll find a lot more detail and some summary steps about how to apply these lessons. We're also working directly with organizations to help them implement some of these principles when they don't have the internal capacity. So I'd urge you to reach out to us if you're interested in being part of this work. And thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Ziad, for that presentation. We've talked about this quite a bit, so I have lots of questions. The challenge is just really picking where to start. So let me start with some of the data that you presented, or a question about the data that you presented. You showed basically what was an estimate to some degree of the amount of bias in the algorithms that you were evaluating. One question I have is, are there thresholds for acceptable levels of bias? And I'm thinking about that in terms of, you could detect bias or an organization can detect bias in an algorithm, and then immediately be faced with the decision about whether or not to continue using that algorithm and potentially, or discontinue using that algorithm and then potentially risk getting any of the benefits from its use, or to try to use it in some limited capacity. And so the question I have is, how do organizations sort of make that determination when bias is detected?
I think that there are two answers to this question. I think there's a simple answer, which is that I think that in many legal settings, the standard that lots of other things, not algorithms, but any kind of potentially discriminatory policy is held to is, a very basic statistical test of significance. And so in our setting, what that would be is, let's take a group of people who have the same algorithm score, and let's separate them out into the Black subpopulation and the white subpopulation. And let's just statistically compare what ends up happening to those people. In our sense, that's on the ideal target, and test whether those two groups are statistically different. So I think that would be a standard that, in a lot of other settings has been held to other instances of discrimination. And so that's kind of a, statistical answer. Now, I think there's a deeper question that you're asking, which is that there's often, let me just distinguish between two settings. In health, we're often dealing with algorithms that are fundamentally helpful. So for example, in this setting that we talked about, we're trying to find people who need extra help and target resources to the people who need extra help. In that setting, it's a real problem, both in terms of bias, but in terms of just what the algorithm is supposed to be doing if that extra help isn't going to the right people. what we found is that it wasn't going to the right people, and the people that were missing out were more likely to be Black. And so there's both a great business case for fixing the algorithm and a great case for anyone who's interested in promoting racial equity. And I think that's often the case in health when we're allocating a scarce resource. We want that resource to go to the people who need it, and those people are often more disadvantaged. In a lot of other settings, for example, in finance, it's a little bit different. So because of structural barriers and historical discrimination, the people who need, for example, credit are often less likely to repay loans. And so in that setting, I think there's a legal standard around business necessity, which is that, to stay afloat, creditors can't be giving loans to people who are not going to repay their loan. That's part of the business necessity of being a creditor, is finding people who are going to pay back loans and pricing the credit accordingly. So I think that that's maybe the other part of the legal standard, is that we do have laws that provide for this business necessity purpose for algorithms. And I think that's the category that I would put that in. So is it an quote unquote acceptable level of bias? Well, it's never an acceptable level of bias, but under the law, there is provision for business necessity for people who are less likely to pay back a loan to be charged a higher rate to accurately represent that risk of not paying back a loan. And I think that's the standard that, at least in our work with some regulators at the state level, is being applied to algorithms as well.
I see. And as moving towards some of your work directly with organizations, can you talk? Sorry about that. Can you talk a little bit about the costs associated with applying the playbook? So you give a lot of practical tips about that organizations can actually use. But in your experience, can you discuss the costs that are incurred? So like were there significant costs in hiring staff in order to audit algorithms? Are there significant additional costs incurred by organizations?
So the way we tried to structure the playbook was really grounded in the work that we've been doing with organizations over the past couple of years. And that work was using existing resources. So using the technical teams that are already deployed within an organization and applying some of these principles from the playbook, we were able to conduct an inventory of algorithms, identify potentially problematic ones, and audit them without hiring new staff, without devoting a lot of additional resources to it. Now, how intensive is it of existing resources? Well, you do need to allocate time to actually building up that inventory. And that sometimes requires putting together a lot of information from different business units in the organization. You also need to be very thoughtful about articulating, okay, what is this algorithm supposed to be doing? What is it actually doing? Does that put this algorithm at risk of generating bias? Now, is that a substantial cost? I think it requires like part of an FTE for a few months to kind of do this realistically, and that's what we've seen in organizations. But I would say that it's almost an illusion to think that there's no cost to letting the status quo be the status quo. What we've seen over and over again in a lot of organizations is that there are fundamentally flawed algorithms that are affecting thousands, or in some cases millions, of customers, of patients at scale. And so there's a huge cost, both in terms of regulatory risk and just in terms of algorithms not fit for business purpose in not doing these things. And so I think that's why I think it's an illusion to try to save costs by not doing these things. These things are eventually going to come to light, whether it's in bad business decisions or in terms of regulatory exposure. And so I think this is a pretty good investment of a small amount of resources considered, on an organizational basis.
That really resonates with me because from a security perspective, we sort of make the same argument, right? That the upfront costs that you pay almost always tend to be better than the cost you'd have to pay on the back end after an incident occurs. So that makes total sense.
I remember you also telling me that argument sometimes isn't that persuasive to people for security. So
it hasn't been, but it's changing slowly. Maybe some FTC fines have helped with that. Do you have recommendations for information that organizations can provide to show that their algorithms have been subjected to a reasonable process or have been audited in some meaningful way? I guess conversely, questions that consumers can ask to try to understand that the algorithms that they're being subject to actually have been vetted, at least in some way, to try to identify bias.
Yeah, it's a really great question because I think that, unlike in a lot of other industries, like in finance, there's enormous documentation requirements that are imposed on companies by the regulatory system. And I think in these algorithmic settings, there's no corresponding need to document what the algorithm is doing or how it's performing or that it's unbiased. So let me just kind of give you two thoughts based on our work that went into the playbook. Number one is that the inventory and the documentation of performance of an algorithm actually doesn't need to be public. It should be maintained internally and it should be kept on file so that if anyone asks questions, whether that's someone internally, whether it's a regulator, that information is available. And a company can very easily show that the algorithms that it's using are both doing what they're supposed to be doing and not introducing bias into the decisions. On the other hand, I think that all of the work that we've done doesn't require opening up the black box of the algorithm. And so in order to do the work that we published in our original paper a couple of years ago, or any of this work that we've done in the playbook, all we need are the algorithm scores and some readout of what the ideal target would be. So in our setting, this was how did the patient do in terms of their health? Putting those data together is actually something that doesn't need to compromise trade secrets. It can be done by an external auditor very easily with the right data. And so I think that those kinds of audits are appealing because they don't require us to do a lot of complex work on the inside of the algorithm or open up the box or, to the previous session's point, there are lots of transparency methods for illustrating exactly what the algorithm is doing. Our method actually doesn't require that. We just need the score and then the ultimate judge of whether the algorithm is doing what it's supposed to do in the form of that ideal target.
Oh, no, I think that's really a great point, that the point about not needing to open up the black box, because I think in certain other contexts, some organizations may be reluctant to share auditing information because they feel like that puts their intellectual property at risk. So it's nice to know that companies can go through this process and share information about the lack of bias in their algorithms without revealing trade secrets. I think related to that point, and also mentioning something from the previous panel, I'm wondering the degree to which that's true in the face of using proxy variables. So the previous panel talked about proxy variables for gender and for race. And can you still get that same guarantee of being able to thoroughly analyze an algorithm and withhold sort of the proprietary information in the face of proxy variables or the use of proxy variables?
And here, let me just make sure I understand. These are the proxy variables that you need to, when you don't have access to someone's self-reported race, the ones that can be imputed using like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau method or things like that. Are those the proxies you mean?
Or proxies that are defined internally by the organization itself. I guess if they're different contexts, then maybe you can talk about sort of where the difference lies.
Yeah, so in a lot of our work, for example, it's very common for health insurers actually not to have data on the race of the people that they're insuring. And so in those settings, I think there are two sets of solutions. And I think this holds whether they're external variables like race or internally defined proxies. One solution is that you can often actually get those data if they're important. So for example, one health insurer we're working with is requesting self-reported race information on their insured population from the healthcare systems that they're reimbursing for care. So the health systems have those data because they can ask the patient directly. And if the insurer wants it, they can request it and merge that into their data. There are also a lot of places where you can purchase those data and merge them in. So just like you can purchase someone's credit score and merge that into your data set at some cost, you can do the same for race from a variety of external sources. And so I think those two options are actually both somewhat underrated. I think historically we haven't prioritized getting these information. And it's almost like sometimes companies don't want to know because they're under the impression that, if I don't know about disparities, I can't be held accountable for them. And I think from my involvement in some civil investigations that I unfortunately can't talk about, I can assure you those companies that is not the case. And I don't think that's the case at the federal level either. So I think those two are really important to flag. On the other hand, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau also has endorsed a method of imputing someone's race, for example, based on a combination of zip code and other demographic information that you do have. And so I think that's a reasonable alternative in cases where you don't have the real variable and you have to rely on proxies.
And I think that's great. And I really want to just sort of confirm my understanding of what you're saying, which is that the use of proxies shouldn't necessarily be a limiting factor in an organization's ability to audit its algorithms for bias.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Okay.
Because it's certainly, those proxies, even if they're imperfect, are certainly going to give you a readout. They're going to be correlated to the real variables of interest with all the caveats that they're not exactly right. And I think, from an optics point of view, one thing I found is that regulators genuinely just want biased algorithms not to be used. They're, at least the ones that we've been working with, there hasn't been like a punitive or unreasonable standard held. And so if you're a company and you're making good faith efforts to understand the amount of bias in your algorithms and reduce them, I think that goes a long way. And those proxies can certainly help with that.
All right. Well, Ziad, we can go on about this for hours, which we've nearly done in a few of our previous conversations. I really want to thank you again for taking the time to present to the Privacycon community. And let's see, I think next up we have a short break and we'll reconvene with the next panel at 10:55. Ziad, thank you again very much. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Privacy awareness with short privacy statements. We've all seen these kind of short notices. We might not statements. We've all seen these kind of short notices.
Hello and welcome to panel 2 of Privacycon 2021. My name is Danielle Estrada and I'm an attorney in the Division of Privacy and Information Protection at the Federal Trade Commission. I'd like to welcome you to this panel entitled Privacy Considerations and Understanding. We look at issues like how do we ensure that users find and understand privacy notices? How do we understand and measure their privacy choices? And when they are affected by data breaches, what can we learn from their responses? I'm joined today by a group of distinguished scholars who will be presenting their research addressing these different ways to measure and understand user awareness of privacy policies and data breaches, as well as different approaches to improve user decision-making and increase awareness. You will hear from Nico Ebert of Zurich University of Applied Sciences, presenting the paper, Bolder is Better, Raising User Awareness Through Salient and Concise Privacy Notices. Siddhant Arora of Carnegie Mellon University, presenting Finding a Choice in a Haystack, Automatic Extraction of Opt-out Statements from Privacy Policy Text. Cameron Cormilo of Virginia Tech, presenting his paper, Reconsidering Privacy Choices, the Impact of Defaults, Reversibility, and Repetition. And finally, Peter Mayer of Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, presenting Now I'm a Bit Angry, Individuals' Awareness, Perception, and Responses to Data Breaches that Affected Them. As before, if you have questions for any of the presenters, please remember to submit them via email to privacycon@ftc.gov or via Twitter at #privacycon21. I will be asking each of the presenters questions after they present their papers and then open up discussion amongst the group at the end if we have time. Finally, I encourage you after the presentation to go to the Privacycon 2021 page at ftc.gov to access their full papers. With that, I would like to turn it over to Nico Ebert to present his research.
Thank you very much, Daniel. My name is Nico Ebert from Zurich University of Applied Sciences, or ZHAW. I'll be talking about privacy notices, probably one of the most boring topics in the whole world. But I'm going to hope to show you that it doesn't have to be this boring at all. This is work we have conducted together with Kurt Ackermann and Björn Scheppler. Our paper is titled "Bold is Better, Raising User Awareness Through Salient and Concise Privacy Notices." So next slide, please, which is, and the question is like, is it possible to raise privacy awareness with short privacy statements? We've all seen these kind of like short notices. We might not like actively have looked at them, but companies have started to use them. Like, for example, Apple in Apple Pay has these small notices in their apps. Or recently, WhatsApp has used short text hints in their app when they change their general privacy terms and conditions, or let's say they try to change their privacy terms and conditions. And the question is, do these work in any way? Do customers perceive these kind of short notices in any way, or do people just ignore them like they ignore traditional long legal privacy policy statements that are legally required? So is this more effective than what we had before? That's a question. And in order to answer this question, we did an online experiment. To the next slide, please. Located in Germany, we created a fictitious fitness tracking application, which looked pretty real. And we asked participants in an experiment to give us feedback to this fitness tracking app. What the participants didn't know at the time was that we put in privacy notices, like very short privacy notices, in different ways. To the right, you see what was inside these notices, which text was inside these notices, and they were embedded in this app. We had about more than 2,000 participants that used our app with these notices deployed in the app. So we changed different things with regards to these privacy notice. And the first thing, and this is what brings us to the next slide, was the level of saliency. We changed it in 3 different ways. We had these short notices with privacy information just hidden behind a link. This is still very common in practice, that you have to click a link in order to get to the privacy information. We call this policy via click. We made an exclusive presentation, meaning that every user would have to see the privacy policy. So basically, everybody should have clicked through the app and would have seen the privacy policy. And in the last design, we had users that saw them privacy information just below app features. So we call this embedded. So whenever we had a specific feature of the app, we had the related privacy information next to the feature, which is very comparable to the way Apple did it with Apple Pay in my introduction. So that was one thing. That was how salient our privacy information was embedded in the app. And the second dimension, next slide, please, was the level of risk of the information. So what we did was we had like a very privacy-friendly version of our privacy policy. And we had a very aggressive privacy-intrusive version of our privacy policy, one that probably no company would ever use if they are not forced to do so, which, for example, had stuff in it. This app records everything you do with your microphone. This app stores your location data forever. This app saves your listening habits, songs you listen while running. And if they are pirated, it's directly reported. So this was very aggressive text, because that was our intention or our hypothesis. Maybe nobody will ever read those texts. So let's at least try to make them very aggressive, very privacy intrusive, to see if we can actually have some kind of reaction. Next slide, please. So in the end, we ended up with a 3x2 design, meaning that we had these more than 2,000 participants, and we assigned them to different groups. So we had one group that saw low-risk policies, privacy-friendly policies, and one group of these saw high-risk policies. And then we had the subgroups where we had the policies hidden behind a link, where we had this exclusive presentation, where we had this embedded policy. And then as a seventh group, we had a control group where there was no policy text at all included. As I told you, we didn't tell the people that it's about privacy policy text, but about testing the app. So we then did some distraction questions, asking them, how did you like our app? Would you recommend it to your friends and everything? But then suddenly we asked people for recall. Do you recall where the app saves your data? Do you recall if the app uses the sensor? So people had to take a little bit of a quiz right at the end of our experiment. And that was basically the essence of our experiments, in order to see if the stuff is really working. Because a lot of previous experiments told people to read the policies, but our assumption is that basically the behavior is very different if it's and more natural if you're not telling people to read the stuff, but still ask them to recall the information. So in the end, I now show you the results on the next slide. We asked 8 questions in total. People had 4 possible answers, of only which one was correct. And I told you people could also guess. We had to account for this guessing effect. And that's what our control condition was good for, where no privacy policy was included. So this was some kind of a baseline for guessing. If people really don't remember anything, they would probably have a score of 2.5 correct answers. And on the left-hand side, you see the net recall score, which is already accounts for this guessing effect. So you could also say this is basically true knowledge. People really remember stuff, so already accounting for this guessing effect. And as you can see, in the click condition, people don't remember anything. And this is easy to explain because simply nobody clicked on the link. Like out of, as far as I remember, it was like 800 people in this condition. Basically nobody, or I think 16 people clicked the link. However, in the exclusive condition, when it was very, very bold, everybody had to see it, people start to remember stuff. For example, in the privacy-friendly condition, people could answer 2 questions correctly. And in the privacy-intrusive condition, it was even close to 3 answers made correctly. The embedded condition was less effective. So when the privacy information was embedded below other information, the recall score declined, but was still more effective than placing it behind a link. On the right-hand side, you see the time that participants spent in the conditions, and you see that they actually spend more time in conditions where the privacy information was presented in a more salient way, which demonstrate that people actually spend time reading the information which explains the recall that we saw in the recall score. Which brings us to the very last slide. So what did we learn in this experiments? Basically, we conclude that these concise and very short privacy notices are a very promising approach to increase user awareness in terms of recall. Saliency has a very a huge effect on the awareness of the data practices that is measured by a recall performance in our experiments. So if you make it not very salient at all, there's no effect. If you make it highly salient, you have what we would say huge effect, giving or taking into account that basically nobody or a lot of people are probably not even interested in this information. So saliency has a big effect. Making it like bold is better than just embedding it. And very much in compliance with our expectation, if it's risky, then people recall it better. We have chosen a very specific context. It was also just a lab experiment, so it's not a field experiment. That would have to be done in the future, really trying it out. But you could also say that our conclusion is that this result is very similar to what probably people in marketing research would confirm. So it is possible to basically make relevant information like perceived by people. So it is not a natural law that privacy policy and the information that's inside is not perceived by people. So it is possible, if you really wanted to do this, to present them in a form that is perceivable by the people. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nico. I wanted to follow up on, to start on your discussion of brevity and sort of how short policy texts can be useful to create better privacy awareness. Can you elaborate on that and how that can help users?
Yes, maybe we can switch to the slide again. I'm not sure if the slide is still open. I'm pretty sure that you all have seen this WhatsApp. I mean, I guess many of you are using WhatsApp. They have exactly used the same approach. So they picked up information they consider relevant, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people were able to perceive these kind of information if presented in this form. It's basically still a big challenge what information to pick. And what information you can choose in order to present it. You cannot simply compress your 10-page privacy policy into like 5 sentences, that's for sure. So one of the main challenges is going to be what information is relevant to the people if you want to use these formats. And also people in marketing research have answered this question. So it requires consumer research. Probably also regulators have a say what is relevant. But basically you have to discover now what's relevant in order to display this in an adequate textual form.
And sort of following up on that, how have you found in your own research how consumers decide what information is relevant in these texts?
Yes, so one thing that is immediately came out of this paper is obviously information or stuff that is risky or that is potentially risky is considered to be relevant. And previous research also of ours has shown that it's mostly to do with third-party data sharing. That's, for example, one classical risk that seems to be relevant or seems to be a relevant concern. That's one example of what people would probably consider as a relevant privacy information.
Thanks. You also mentioned earlier the issue of icons and the use of icons by organizations, and that's something we definitely have seen a greater increase of in terms of using icons in connection with privacy notifications. Maybe you can talk a little how text can be combined with icons and what your research has found there.
Yeah, so we haven't on our own carried research about this topic of using icons, but there's a lot of research already, or they're starting to get more research on these icons. And basically, yes, you can combine them. This is also what companies do. But I would say that you can use them both ways. You can use them to warn people, to get their attention. You can also use them to make a cozy atmosphere so that they probably wouldn't even read the text. So it's like signs on the street that tell you about the tempo limit. You could imagine different forms of design with the same information, but with different outcomes. So this really needs investigation, because I would argue that you can have any kind of effect. Like, remember this Apple sign of these two shaking hands? Would be interesting to see if people, if this already raises trust, and probably nobody ever reads the information below anymore. So that's an interesting question to study. But generally, I think it's possible to combine them. Combine text also with icon, and that's an efficient combination.
Sounds like an interesting extension of what you've been doing.
Yes.
You've talked a lot about this use of short policy texts and distilling the information within longer policy notices. Do you have a view on whether traditional policy disclosure documents are needed any longer?
So my assumption is that they are just needed by law. Like I'm not a lawyer. The companies I've been talking to would tell me that it's required to have one. It's required to have terms and conditions, but they are aware it's not an effective information measure. So what you could do is still have your old long policy text required by law, but use more like salient, shorter, user-friendly, user-understandable ways for this parts of information that should be really perceived. So I think we will end up with a combination, and that's, for example, already what Apple and also WhatsApp, Facebook did, was just using them in combination with the policies that they have already. For example, TikTok would be a nice example of having kids-friendly privacy policies. Like they have a very kids-friendly app, but their privacy policy is more lawyer-friendly, although they made it easier. But I think you can combine it very good with long policy texts.
And do you have a view on how to enforce or kind of ensure that more companies or more organizations are using these short, salient policy texts that your research found to be effective in reaching consumers?
Yes, that's a very good and interesting question. I mean, it's very difficult to enforce this. There are for sure companies that have an own interest to create awareness of their privacy practices. If it has to be, or if it's done via regulation, I guess it's getting complex. You would probably need very precise, like, for example, also design recommendations on what has to be presented, because otherwise you will always find ways around design ways. You can beat salience with salience by making some other thing more salient. That's what we also demonstrated. So if you embedded the text beneath a very nice image of a landscape, nobody will read the text anymore. So basically, if you really want to regulate this kind of topics, you would have to look at other areas of regulation. For example, in Europe, we have discussed nutrition labels that are basically very highly standardized on a pixel level. You would have to do this in order to really enforce this.
Thank you. Thanks, Nico. That's all I have for now. I appreciate this was a very interesting presentation, and I appreciate the time you've taken to answer my questions. I'm now going to turn it over to Siddhant Arora to make his presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Siddhant Ora from Carnegie Mellon University, and I'm here to give a presentation on our recently published work on extracting opt-out statements from privacy policies. This work was presented in WWW 2020 conference and conducted as part of the Usable Privacy Policy project. So next slide, please. Our paper concerns opt-out choices. These choices allow user to opt out of companies sending them email communications, targeting advertisements based on their behaviors, and sharing personal information with third parties. But these options are often buried deep in policy text, and many users do not know that they are even there. Our goal in this work is to help these users. In this work, we want to understand if we can get computer to read these privacy policies. We have previously had some success in automatically extracting useful information from privacy policies. We ask ourselves whether similar approaches could be used to automatically extract opt-out choices from the text of privacy policies and make them more readily accessible and visible to the end users. So we are now going to watch a short video motivating the impact of this work. Next slide, please. Yeah, can you play the video?
While many websites offer users choices to opt out of some of their data collection and use practices, most of these choices are buried deep in the text of long, jargon-filled privacy policies and are never seen by users. Different privacy regulations grant users the right to opt out of practices relying on the collection and use of their data. This includes the right to opt out of having one's data shared with third parties for different purposes, the right to opt out of receiving marketing emails, the right to opt out of cookies, and more. But as it stands, most websites don't offer easy and practical access to these choices, effectively depriving users of their rights. To help make opt-out choices more accessible to users, a team of researchers from Carnegie Mellon University has developed a browser extension called Opt-Out Easy, which uses machine learning technology to automatically find opt-out choices for users as they browse from one website to another. Opt-Out Easy is available to both Chrome and Firefox users. By clicking on the extension's icon, users are presented with opt-out links found in the privacy policy of the website that they are currently visiting, allowing them to, for example, opt out of analytics or limit marketing emails. Start practicing your right to privacy with Opt-Out Easy today.
The major research contributions of our work are the following. We build machine learning classifiers to automatically extract these opt-out choices from the privacy policies. We built a browser extension to show the opt-outs for a given website. The browser extension is now publicly available and can be downloaded from the link shown on the slide. Another benefit of the automatic classification approach presented in this work is that it actually enables people to more systematically analyze opt-out demographics within and across different categories of websites. Next slide. The privacy policies are presented on web pages, but there are often no standard location for the privacy policies. We built a crawler and a logistic regression model that found the page containing a privacy policy for the given website. We were able to obtain 236 web pages containing privacy policies. We further split up the text of the privacy policy into what we call as segments based on line breaks. We relied on links to third-party services like DAA and NAI to automatically identify these opt-outs. We further built machine learning classifiers for the remaining hyperlinks that are more difficult to identify as opt-out. To train these classifiers, we manually annotated 2,692 hyperlinks. Next slide, please. Up until this point, we have discussed about the pipeline we built in order to collect the annotations. Although that information is useful in itself, it is of paramount importance to understand the type of an opt-out. Hence, we decided to do a fine-grained analysis of the opt-out choices. During the data collection process, we would annotate each hyperlink with up to 2 data practice categories. These categories were based on the privacy regulations proposed in Europe and US like GDPR and CCPA. Some of these opt-out categories are even required by law. Next slide. So we trained text-based classifiers where we would generate features based on the segment text, the URL of a hyperlink, and the anchor text associated with a hyperlink to automatically categorize a hyperlink as an opt-out. In the example that we see in the slide, we can see how the hyperlink text go to ad settings and the surrounding text discussing managing ad preferences can help to classify the given hyperlink as an opt-out. Overall, our classifiers were able to achieve a precision of 0.93, that is, 93% of the hyperlinks classified as opt-out were in fact opt-out, and a recall of 0.90, that is, our classifiers were able to successfully extract 90% of the opt-out hyperlinks. So next slide. After building classifiers which are able to categorize the opt-outs into different data practices, we wanted to study the demographics of these opt-outs. Hence, we perform an analysis on around 7,000 privacy policies. Here are the 3 questions which we want to answer. Next animation. Out of the websites which we analyzed, how many websites had opt-outs? Next animation. We can see that most of the policies do not have any opt-outs, which is consistent with the previous findings. Next animation. What is the average number of opt-outs per website and how is it related to the popularity of the website? Next animation. So in the graph that we see on the slide, we see that the mean number of opt-outs based on the Alexa rank of a website. We observed that higher ranked websites had more opt-outs in them. Next animation. We also wanted to understand the distribution of opt-out categories. Next animations. This graph shows the distribution of various opt-out categories that we have recognized for the top 200 most popular websites. The distribution of opt-out hyperlinks are skewed, with most of the websites providing advertising opt-out hyperlinks. It was also observed that these trends were similar irrespective of the website's popularities. Next slide. So up until now, we have discussed ways of finding opt-outs and doing an analysis of the opt-out categories on the web. But our work will have more value when we can provide this technique as a service to the end user so that privacy takes a front seat. In our opinion, the best way we could package this service is with the help of a browser extension. So we have built an extension called Opt-out Easy, which would make it easier for people to find and opt out of data practice controls. This extension is publicly available with the download link mentioned on the slide, and we encourage you to download it right now. So in this extension, we used an iterative design approach and came up with 4 important screens in the end. Next animation. The first one shows you the opt-out practices and the kind of opt-outs for a given website. Next animation. The second screen displays the list of websites you visited and all the opt-out controls which are associated with that particular website. It will show you the opt-out controls which you have visited in blue, and it proactively encourages you to take action and opt out of unwanted data practices. Next animation. We also have a help page in the extension that will show users the working of the plugin. Next animation, please. We analyze the privacy policies offline and store the results in the database. We only show the results of analyzed policy to the users. However, Opt-out Easy also allow user to request for websites that have not been analyzed yet. We then run our analysis to populate the result for those websites and show them later. So next slide. So as we have seen, our technology does a pretty good job at extracting opt-out choices. But how useful and usable is the browser extension that we have developed? To answer this question, we decided to run a human subject study. We performed a control experiment with 8 participants. The treatment group was explained and given access to the browser extension. So we asked users to perform 5 opt-out tasks on 4 different websites. This task was to opt out of a data practice category based on the prompt which the test subject was given. We see that the time taken for opting out in almost all tasks is much more in the control group than the treatment group. Also, the success rate is higher for the treatment group over the control group. This is because the users get fed up of searching for an opt-out and eventually decided to give up. So next slide. So here are some of the discussion points from our user study. Users are often unaware of the available opt-out choices and sometimes lack the necessary knowledge needed for them to opt out successfully. The opt-out hyperlinks are often broken and take too much time to respond, which makes the user give up and quit out of the opt-in process. Due to all these reasons, we believe that privacy laws should put pressure to ensure that these services are always available in the form of standardized APIs. Next slide. So the final takeaway from this presentation are that we have developed techniques that are capable of identifying opt-out text from privacy policies. We have presented a browser extension which is available in both Google Chrome and Mozilla Firefox. We encourage you to download the browser extension right now and take privacy in your own hands. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks, Siddhant. That was a very interesting presentation, and it's a very interesting tool you've put together here for us. I want to start by asking you on a point you raised a couple of slides ago, which is from a regulatory standpoint, as you know, we here at the FTC, our regulatory agency, what does your research suggest about future regulations for opt-out choices for users?
Yeah, so that's like a really good question. So our research makes 3 suggestions about future regulation of opt-out choices. The first suggestion is that the privacy laws should put pressure to ensure that these services are available in the form of standardized APIs. Like I talked about earlier in our user study, we observed that not every website offers the same number of opt-outs, and these opt-out hyperlinks were often broken and took too much time to respond. They had often multiple levels of indirections, which would finally show that the service is temporarily unavailable. So because all of this waiting period, the users eventually just give up and quit out of this opting out process. So due to all these reasons, despite our classifiers having very high precision and recall, it is often difficult for the end users to opt out. So we believe we should not have to rely on machine learning, but these opt-out links should be readily discoverable in the form of like standardized APIs. Also, once we have these APIs, user would no longer need to do this for website to website, but can always choose to opt out by setting up preferences in a plugin like the Opt-out Easy browser extension that we have just made. Our second suggestion was about opt-out settings. So our lab has conducted prior research on people's preferences to opt-out practices through qualitative and quantitative surveys. And what was observed was that settings which allow these intrusive practices by default were more burdensome to end users than the settings which are contextualized based on website categories. So that's another interesting direction. And the third suggestion was that there needs to be focus on nudging users towards making beneficial choices pertaining to privacy decision making. And our lab has done a lot of research focused on that. So, yeah.
Thank you. I want to turn now to the tool you've created and find out whether and how you plan to continue developing it and improving the performance of your system and in finding and categorizing opt-outs. I know you've tested it to some extent, but it's still a new tool. So how do you plan on continuing to develop it?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. So our classifiers are currently trained on a corpus of 2,700 hyperlinks. So we believe that increasing this corpus size by manually annotating more opt-outs will likely improve the performance for our classifiers. And also we plan to do future work on additional feature engineering to improve the performance of our system. Another direction that we can explore is that currently we use a classifier for determining whether a web page contains a privacy policy and what is the location of privacy policy for a given web page. So improving the performance of this classifier can improve the performance of our end system in extracting the opt-out choices. Also, currently our methodology is limited to extracting opt-out links that use anchor tags. On manual inspection, we observed that opt-outs can also occur as like non-anchor tags with JavaScript event handlers that would automatically redirect the users. So this is so we plan to extend our methodology towards capturing such opt-out links as well. Another thing that we are currently exploring is that we are going to try following given hyperlink and downloading the web page that the hyperlink leads to. We believe that this could also help in detecting if the given hyperlink is an opt-out or not. So, yeah.
Thanks. It sounds like a lot of interesting avenues to explore there. What kind of analysis is facilitated by your research on automatically identifying and categorizing opt-out? So, like, what other analysis is born out of your research?
Yeah, so that's like a very interesting question. And one of the benefits that we think of this automatic classification approach is that it would actually enable people and regulators to more systematically analyze the opt-out demographics within and across different website categories, like based on different website popularities, website sectors, and so on. We hope that moving forward, this type of systematic analysis will be used to inform public policy debates. We also believe that our work has a lot of potential in being used for compliance. In particular, with like the introduction of the California Consumer Privacy Act, which requires an opt-out on the sale of one's data. It would be interesting to see if we can extend the approach presented here and do a systematic analysis looking at the presence of opt-out hyperlinks focused on this requirement. That is like, what percentage of websites are in compliance with this rule? How does this compliance varies with like website popularities and website sectors and so on? We are also currently looking into a more extensive study at how sectoral regulations can affect the presence of opt-outs, like US financial organizations are required by Graham-Leach-Billy Act to have these opt-out notices. So that's another direction. And future work might also examine the jurisdiction under which different sites operate and to what extent do these like jurisdiction affect the number and type of opt-outs. For example, we are currently looking at the US and German policy for the same website and trying to analyze how do they differ in the number and type of opt-outs, and how can this be attributed to the location-specific privacy regulations like GDPR in EU or like CCPA in US and so on? So, yeah.
Great. Finally, I just wanted to ask you if you could remind us: is your extension opt out easy? Is that available to the public? And can I use it now?
Yeah, you can. So the opt-out easy is publicly available as a browser extension, which is available in both Google Chrome and Mozilla Firefox. And we strongly encourage you to download the browser extension right now and take privacy in your own hands. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Siddhant. That was a really that's a really interesting tool that you've created for people to explore. I'm now going to turn to Cameron Cormilo to present his paper. Cameron.
Hi, thank you, Danielle. If we go to the next slide, please. So as Danielle said, my name is Cameron Cormilo. I'm a third-year PhD student at Virginia Tech. And my co-author in this paper and my PhD advisor is Dr. Idrissa Jared, also Virginia Tech. He studies and has inspired my interest in the economics of privacy. Next slide, please. So the problem that we are addressing in our paper kind of arose out of this sort of frightening reality that is the current state of online consent. So as you can see, I chose my background today to be the Pont des Arts Bridge in Paris, or more commonly known as the Lovelock Bridge. And I felt that this was a pretty good visualization for the state of today's privacy landscape. So the bridge itself, you can think of as representing one's own personal privacy, and each lock is another decision that needs to be made. Do I turn the key or do I throw it into the Seine? Do I consent to some online data practice or not? And as I'm sure many of you also know, in 2014, guardrails from the bridge began to collapse under the weight of the locks, kind of deteriorating the safety and structure of the bridge itself. And as you may expect, consent rates for these decisions are astronomically high. And the tools that industry has or regulation has used to kind of prevent this have been largely ineffective. So for example, the ad choices program, which gives users the ability to opt out of behaviorally targeted ads, was only used in 0.23% of all American ad impressions. And this kind of phenomenon is similarly substantiated by academic research. And there have been past papers that have seen almost universal acceptance to privacy policies, even when they include the naming rights for their first child, access to the airspace above their homes for drone traffic, and sharing all of their data with the NSA. So as you can see, this is kind of a very strong and frightening phenomenon. And the causes of this have been discussed and disputed over the last decade or two. So some, industry professionals and academics cite consumer indifference to privacy concerns. Maybe people just aren't that concerned about their privacy, or comparatively, they have very high valuations for the online services, and those valuations kind of overpower any concern they do have for privacy. However, a significant portion of the research has kind of converged around the idea that most consumers do not actively evaluate the costs and benefits of consenting to these online data practices. And this is especially true for the most important privacy decisions that are often implicit and are difficult to reverse while being covered up by the complexity of the choice presentation. So if you go to the next slide. So regulators and policymakers have largely taken notice of these concerns. And this is reflected in the enactment of both broad and all-encompassing, regulatory changes like GDPR and CPRA, as well as the more specific federal regulation that, is largely championed by our hosts today. And with each new regulation that's passed, we have new opportunities for research. However, a lot of the current research focuses on the broad policy effects. And it's nice to know that, GDPR as a whole has a positive or a negative effect. But this only gives lawmakers a small sliver of the story, where in reality, these primary effects need to be further broken down and differentiated. We need to consider specific tenets of the regulation. What parts of GDPR, for example, increased rates of consent? What parts decreased it? And this more specific consideration can then further inform future regulation and allow for a much more detailed formulation of policy. If you go to the next slide. So our work specifically isolates 3 tenets of GDPR and aims to understand their individual effects as well as any interactive effects that they may have within each other. So first, we look largely at the change in consent structure required by GDPR Article 9. So this requires that consent elicitation is explicit. It bans the use of implicit consent that utilizes a default opt-in structure. So an opt-in default in this context would implicitly allow for consent while requiring a consumer to make an active change if they decided that they did not want to consent. And in the academic literature, the consideration of this type of change in choice presentation is called choice architecture, or how the design of a choice can differ when presented to consumers and how these differences impact the subsequent decision making. So default choices, as discussed here, are a very popular tool of choice architecture, and they can take advantage of consumer decision biases and encourage some sort of particular outcome. So second, we consider reversible consent required by Article 7 GDPR, and this drastically refigures the structure of consent in such a way that consumers now know that the choice they are making is not permanent. It can be revisited at a later date. And while this is meant to give individuals more control over their privacy, this could also lead consumers to viewing the choices maybe less serious or less pressing. And this could even encourage them to be more lax with their decision. And finally, we look at a largely implicit change from GDPR that has resulted in consent elicitation being highly repetitive. And we can see this represented by the countless locks here on the Lovelock Bridge. Previously, privacy decisions were explicitly made only occasionally when signing up for a new service or creating a social media platform account, for example. However, as we have all seen, almost every interaction with the website is now accompanied by a cookie banner asking consumers to continuously make consent decisions. And this repetition has the potential to further influence consumer choice. It may lead to a sense of fatigue where they give in and consent all the time, or it could do the opposite, in which they adjust their belief system slightly each time and eventually learn to make a more informed decision. If we go to the next slide. So given that consideration, we can summarize our research goals as follows. So first, we evaluate the effect of changing choice architecture, or specifically the default consent choices, on the outcome of consumers' privacy decisions. And then second, we explore how reversibility and repeated exposure impact decision-making across these differing choice architectures. If we go to the next slide. So to study this, we conducted an online experiment that asked participants to make a real privacy decision, where they had to decide whether or not to forgo anonymity in the face of a sensitive disclosure. We had roughly 1,500 participants in the study, and it was structured as a 2-factor, 3x3 experiment, where our 2 factors were choice architecture and the reversibility of the choice. And then participants took the experiment 3 times with differences only in the context of the disclosures, resulting in a panel data structure that allowed for us to consider the effect of these repeated privacy choices. As you can see in the table here, participants were either in a universal opt-in structure that defaulted them into consenting, an active choice structure where they had to explicitly choose to consent or not to consent, or a more protective opt-out structure where they were defaulted into not consenting and had to actively change their decision in order to consent. And additionally, they were given either no information as to the reversibility of the choice, or they were explicitly told that the choice was either reversible or irreversible. So we go to the next slide. So this is kind of the procedure of our experiment. Participants were told that they were taking part in a number of surveys that had to do with sensitive information, such as criminal activity, sexual history, and romantic involvement. So they started by creating a research profile, and this kind of mimicked what a consumer may create when signing up for a social media site or some other online service. It asked for demographic information such as gender, race, geographic location, even in the form of zip codes. And then participants were directed to the main treatment. And this is kind of where they were asked whether or not they would like to, in essence, sign in to the research profile, which would link their subsequent disclosures back to them. So this image here shows a picture of this decision where the choice is reversible. You can see in that bolded statement, we tell them that they can change their decision at any time. And it's presented as an active choice where they have to either click sign into my research profile or click continue as guest with no option defaulted. So after making this decision, they were directed to a survey that had the sensitive disclosure questions that I had mentioned. And if they had chosen to log in, their research ID was listed in the top corner of the page, making it very salient that their answers were being linked back to them. And then after the survey, there was a time buffer in the form of a context-specific video that they were asked to watch before directing them to the next of the 3 surveys where the consent decision would be presented again. We go to the next page. So to get into our results, so our first research goal was to identify the effects of changing choice architecture. So expectedly, there's a very significant effect of this treatment. So those in the control group, which was the universal opt-in, chose to log in on average 92% of the time. So it's very significant. And then those in the active choice condition, which is largely the structure that's encouraged by GDPR, participants logged in around 11.5% less, or around 80% of the time. So this definitely had an effect, not too drastic of an effect, but still very significant. And then last, impressively, the protective opt-out manipulation produced a 41% decrease in login rates, with those participants logging in only about half of the time. So you can kind of see the different tiers of protectiveness of these different choice architecture structures. Something that we can use going forward to further kind of find a proper balance for privacy regulation. So we can go to the next slide, please. So perhaps our most interesting results came from the consideration of reversible consent. So we found that when paired with a protective opt-out, both reversibility and irreversibility have strong negative effects on logging in. So this was incredibly surprising to us, given that seemingly opposite constructs, reversibility and irreversibility, had the same directional effects. So what this tells us is that despite our initial thought that reversibility may make individuals more lax and lead to higher rates of consent, giving the user information on reversibility at all is a signal as to the seriousness of the decision. So this, in essence, kind of scares the users out of consenting. And similarly, this effect is only found when paired with an opt-out default. So this tells us that users also recognize that when presented with a privacy protective choice architecture, it's likely due to some sensitivity regarding the decision, and the choice should be made with care. So these two effects interact to very strongly influence the login decision. You go to the next slide, please. So finally, we look at the effects of repetition across the 3 iterations of the study. So we can see that the effect of repetition, interestingly, is also dependent on reversibility. So without any information on reversibility, those in the condition that receive no statement, the effect of the opt-in default, frighteningly, gets stronger over time. So you can see here the coefficients for the constant variable. You can think about that as the average of those that logged in the universal opt-in. So you can see that study 1 saw 92% of participants logging in, and by the final exposure, they were up to almost 96% of participants logging in. This is kind of the worst case scenario in which a choice architecture that really takes a hold of people's cognitive biases not only has a very significant effect up front, but continues to get stronger over time. And however, when they're given an opt-in structure and are given information on reversibility, the effect of the default is still strong, without a doubt, but it remains constant over time. So the last 3 columns here, you can see that it similarly starts around 92%, and that remains constant across the iterations of the study. So this tells us that reversibility and irreversibility counteract the growth of default effects seen otherwise. And we see a similar pattern for protective opt-out defaults, where their effects grow stronger over time in absence of reversibility. But when reversibility is introduced, the effects are kind of all pushed to the forefront, where there's kind of a stronger initial impact of opt-outs, but that remains constant over time. So if we could go to the next slide. So, basically we have to ask what we can take from these results. And largely what we conclude is that there's a delicate balance between protectiveness and economic benefit. So individually, each change that we enacted had the desired effect of consumers choosing options that may better reflect their privacy concerns. So for example, an active choice structure decreased logins and allowed for individuals to explicitly choose which option that they felt most comfortable with. And additionally, informing a user as to the reversibility of the choice can counteract the growth of default effects over time, which is very desirable. However, interactive effects have the ability to produce very large swings in consumer outcomes. So for example, like we had said, when the effect of reversibility was paired with a protective opt-out, that drove consent much further down than we had originally anticipated. So these findings provide very specific insight to policymakers. So we don't give answers relating to the broad effects of privacy policy, but what we do is we isolate specific changes and provide a better understanding as to their effects, as well as how they interact with other changes. This allows for a much richer conversation around future regulation and is essential in striking that important balance between privacy and economic benefit. So with that, I thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Cameron. I want to start by asking you, your study considers the initial choice to consent or not consent to tracking. And maybe you could talk more about what downstream effects this may have on subsequent behavior, such as disclosure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So, as I had said, the structure of this experiment was first the consent decision and then subsequent disclosures. And we did see some slight increases in disclosure, differing by choice architecture. So for example, those in the protective opt-out default conditions disclosed slightly more than those in the universal opt-in condition. However, these effects were very, very small and were not statistically significant. So this tells us that largely consumers don't intertwine the consent and disclosure decisions, right? Which could be concerning. We would expect that maybe more lax privacy settings would result in more trepidation around disclosing sensitive information, but we just don't have the evidence to support that. Now, with that being said, we didn't see effects relating to choice architecture, but we do see some interesting effects relating to reversibility. So participants that were in a condition where the decision was explicitly reversible did disclose almost 20% more than those that were given no information about reversibility. So this could tell us that changes like Article 7 of GDPR that require reversibility, they could lower overall consent rates as we saw, but that may have some impact in increasing disclosure downstream, right? So that's definitely something that needs to be considered when crafting these policies.
I'd also was hoping you may be able to talk about the future of your research stream and how you see privacy policy evolving.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a very important and also very broad question, right? So first and foremost, I truly do hope that, more research is produced that focuses on just a few aspects of privacy regulation. The potential for new and exciting insights to arise out of the huge amount of changes that we've seen in the last decade is very exciting. But in terms of the future of privacy policy generally, I do think that one change we need to see is a refocusing to the individual. So we've made some very important strides in ensuring that companies are behaving responsibly and that consumers have the tools to make responsible decisions. But at the end of the day, the individual remains the decision maker. So, our society, very rightly so, has addressed so many important issues in the last few years through social change and outreach. And I think that privacy could benefit from, being one of those next changes. I'd really love to see the privacy concerns discussed in the panel today and in other panels kind of become general knowledge among the population. And without that policy, well, incredibly important, can only get us so far.
And lastly, I wanted to, and that kind of ties to my next question, which is, there's been an abundant stream of research surrounding the effects of GDPR and other regulation, but maybe you can talk about how you see your research and where it specifically contributes to these discussions in terms of discussions about privacy policies and research of them.
Absolutely. I think that largely a lot of the research falls into two pools. So either you're a free market advocate and you trust consumers to make their own decisions, or you think we need more regulation to protect consumers, right? And both pools have produced groundbreaking findings. They've informed the discussion around data privacy considerably. But what we tried to do differently was kind of remove any pre-existing idea of how privacy should be handled. So we look specifically at what has changed and how it impacts consumer decision making. And our results kind of reflect this approach. We show that it doesn't have to be one side or the other. There can be a balance between the market and regulation. And importantly, policy also doesn't have to be one size fits all. So the FTC has shown us that sector and medium specific regulation can work. For example, maybe healthcare privacy needs to, lean more on the protective side and encourage lower rates of consent through these different choice architectures. But there may be other realms, browsing data online that might benefit from letting the market take more of a role. This is the conversation that I'm hoping to start, and hopefully that future research can continue.
Thanks, Cameron. Well, I share your hope that we can continue these conversations with further research, because these are important issues. And I think, as Nico started us out saying, they may be issues that people view as having been researched extensively in the past. There's a lot left to explore, as all of you have been addressing in your papers, and I'm excited to see where these conversations go. So thank you for that. Last and certainly not least, I want to turn it over to Peter Mayer, who will be presenting his paper. Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. So my name is Peter Mayer, and I will be presenting the work of my colleagues, Yijin Zhou, Florian Schaub, Adam Aviv, and myself. And that is our investigation into individuals' awareness, perception, and response to data breaches that actually affected them. Next slide, please. Now, most people here will be familiar with the term data breaches, but let me quickly define what that meant for us in our research. So for us, a data breach was an event in which private, sensitive, or confidential personal information is leaked to unauthorized third parties. Such data breaches can cause tangible harms when the exposed data is misused for identity theft or account hijacking. And even if these events have not occurred yet, individuals may experience emotional harms as they feel vulnerable or anxious about exposure of this data and misuse in the future. Next, please. When we look at the number of data breaches and exposed data records over time, we see that data breaches are on the rise. For the United States, we see that there were more than 1,000 breaches each year since 2016, leading to more than 1 billion exposed records overall. Yet despite this large number of breaches, recent research also suggests that affected consumers only rarely take action. And this intrigued us, so we wanted to have a closer look with a methodology that was different from what had been done before. Next slide, please. So prior work primarily asked participants about past experience with breaches in general, or asked them to describe intended reactions in hypothetical scenarios. For example, participants should imagine being affected by a specific breach. In our work, we instead probe participants with real-world breaches that are known to have exposed their personal information. Therefore, our survey has a greatly increased ecological validity when compared to this prior work, since participants were more likely to relate to these breaches, and our work also mitigates recall bias, as many participants first learned about the breaches in our study and provided immediate responses. Next slide, please. So to achieve this new methodology, we built our own survey platform that queries the API of Have I Been Pwned. Have I Been Pwned is a web service that collects data from data breaches and allows visitors to enter their email address on the website and see a list of known data breaches tied to that email address. Overall, 413 participants were recruited off the prolific panel in our study and went through the survey in 3 stages. In the first stage, we asked participants to provide their most commonly used email address for querying the Have I Been Pwned API, followed by questions about several properties of the email address, such as its frequency and purpose of use. In case the participant's email was not tied to any breaches, the participants were given the opportunity to enter another email address, which they believed to be more likely to be involved in breaches. In the second phase, all participants that were affected by at least one breach represented up to 3 specific breaches from the full set returned by government code. For each breach, then, we collected data relating to our participants' awareness of the individual breach before our study, their perception of causes and impacts of being affected, their emotional reactions, and if they've done or intend to do anything in response. Then in the end, we collected the participants' demographics and showed them the complete list of known breaches that included their email address to ensure that they're aware of all the risks. And additionally, we provided resources to help participants in taking action and dealing with the potential aftermath of the breaches we showed them. Next slide, please. So using the data from this survey, we aim to answer 5 research questions, namely the factors that influence the likelihood of an email address's exposure to data breaches, the participants' perception of causes and impacts when affected by data breaches, their awareness of the data breaches, their emotional reactions, and their behavioral responses to the data breaches. Next, please. So in this talk, I will only present results regarding 4 of these research questions, namely research question 1, 3, 4, and 5. So what did we find? Well, next slide, please. For the first research question, we investigated the factors that influence email address likelihood of exposure. And we found that many participants were affected. Specifically, 73% of participants appeared in 1 or more breaches, with an average of 5.4 breaches per participant. Therefore, it becomes immediately apparent that most consumers seem to be affected by data breaches. Using quasi-Poisson regression, we found that the number of breaches associated with an email address increases by 8% per year of use. While 8% might sound like a rather small number, the figure on the right shows how this effect actually builds up over time. Next slide, please. Regarding our participants' awareness of data breaches, we found that participants were unaware of the majority, namely 74% of the 792 breaches they saw during the survey, and they were aware of only 80% of them. Next slide, please. In research question 4, we found that participants' liked responses showed a low concern for the breaches overall, as the median was only somewhat concerned. This sentiment was also reflected in the qualitative data we collected, as illustrated with the quote on the right here. Now, these 2 aspects, the low awareness and the long concern, are actually quite critical. Next slide. Because in the investigation pertaining to research question 5, we found that both awareness and concern are key predictors of consumers taking action in response to a breach. So to sum this up, we found that most consumers seem to be affected by data breaches, but are largely unaware and unconcerned of the breaches that affect them. And this in turn leads to decreased action taken by consumers after a breach. So what are the implications of these findings? Next slide, please. That 74% of the breaches were unknown to our participants indicates that current ways of notifying consumers about breaches may not be effective. Therefore, we argue that an important aspect of addressing this issue is the need for regulators to push for stricter requirements for breached organizations regarding when and how to notify their customers. Next, please. Ideally, the notification can be delivered in multiple channels, such as a written letter and an email, or when a customer actually calls in to a company, this could also be an opportunity to make that customer aware and inform about mitigating actions. Using all these channels allows increasing the chance of reaching the affected individual, but the notification must also be understandable and usable for everyone. For example, this could be made better by including easy-to-enact mitigation actions. The important bottom line here is that requiring breach notifications is not sufficient to reach consumers. It also matters how the information is provided in those notices to make sure people really pay attention, understand the risks, and are motivated to take protective action. So the question is what to do about this. Next slide, please. And here we argue that notification alone is not enough, and companies should be required to stay involved in helping affected individuals recover from data breaches. Rather than providing free credit or identity monitoring services, which have limited preventive protections, regulators should mandate or encourage companies to offer more creative protection tools. One example here is tools that allow creating unique email aliases during account creation. Next, please. For example, Sign In with Apple allows users to provide an email address, but they can also choose to hide their email, which means Apple will create a random email address for the sign-in and forward incoming correspondence to the user's real email address. As Sign In with Apple and similar tools see more widespread deployment, more research is needed to understand motivators and barriers behind adoption of such tools. But offering these tools in a well-integrated way would enable users to protect their data with basically no additional friction in the process. And additionally, having these unique email addresses would allow users to identify which services have leaked or sold their data in case they appear in scam, spam, or phishing mails. Next, please. Furthermore, in-situ notification methods, for example, integrated into password managers such as Firefox Logwise, which you can see on the right here, let users learn about breaches and take available action in the moment as they visit a breach site or sort out their credentials in the password manager. And so both of these technologies I just mentioned can more fundamentally help consumers manage their online presence and stay secure by offering benefits beyond the context of data breaches, but in particular there. Next slide, please. And this brings me to the end of my talk. This research was done by my colleagues, Yijin Zhou, Florian Schraub, Adam Aviv, and myself. And if you want to check out the full paper, you can find a link in the QR code on this slide. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I wanted to. This is fascinating, and it's really interesting to hear your views and your research on consumers' awareness or lack thereof of their data, of the many breaches that at least the consumers in your study were affected by, and then the roles that everyone can play to help them and to mitigate the effects. I wanted to start by asking you about what consumers can do to protect themselves and to mitigate the effects of data breaches, and also what consumers can do in response when they do find themselves to be affected by a breach.
So the most effective ways to mitigate effect is proactive measures. Being proactive when creating accounts, making a conscious decision about whether I need the account and which data I actually have to provide to create this account. And to protect the data that is actually needed to create an account. We have seen that there are proactive measures, such as the email aliases, and there are several technologies available. Integrated options like Sign In with Apple work great if you actually have an Apple device, but there are other players in this market. Mozilla has a similar service, and there are others. So using these proactive measures is one of the best choices when you actually have to provide data to protect this. And then as responses to a breach, the most important thing is to first see which data is actually affected, because the response depends on which data has actually leaked. For example, if the passwords or if a password is leaked, you should change that password as soon as possible, as soon as you get become aware of that breach. But also, if that password was used on different websites, you should change it there as well, because there are attacks that just reuse what has been leaked on other websites. And so it's important to not view this one service then in isolation, but see at where this might cause other problems. And this might actually be a good chance, if you're creating a new password anyway, to adopt a different strategy to manage your online presence, for example, a password manager. For example, with these built-in notification options, that then helps you to stay on top of things even more.
Thank you. Those are all really helpful suggestions. I wanted to then turn to the actions that organizations can take to mitigate the effects of breaches. I mean, there's so many different layers in this ecosphere of different entities that, consumers will interact with. But specifically, what did your research show in terms of breached organizations? What sort of effects can there, or what actions can they take to best mitigate the effects of the breaches that they've encountered for consumers?
I think the biggest factor that we identified here that is relevant to this question is the lack of awareness that we saw in our participant sample. And this indicates that companies really need to be more active when notifying their consumers, because before I can take protective actions, I need to be aware that something has happened. And so companies should notify their customers as soon as the company becomes aware of the breach. And, to become aware, they should have a monitoring of their systems to actually see if something gets lost. And then if actually something happens, then they should use every channel they have at their disposal, right? The traditional ways have proven to be not too effective. And so interacting with customers on that particular breach, like if they call in to order something and that they have not changed their password yet, this might be a perfect opportunity to call them on it. And to really go out there, like it might not be really for the company a desirable thing to have a big banner on their front page that says, we've been affected by a data breach. But it would definitely help make people aware. And so companies should be more open to take creative approaches to notifying people. And now for organizations, in terms of developers, they might also want to integrate these technologies into their tools. For example, allow sign in with Apple or similar technologies. Support this in the app so that consumers can actually choose this technology. And I think we would like organizations to be more proactive and really notify about all the breaches, not just high-risk ones, because it has actually been shown, and this is not our research, but related research, that companies that take responsibility and that help people in this situation actually face less severe consequences in terms of lawsuits, for example.
Thank you. And then finally, I wanted to ask you, we've now talked consumers and organizations, but from a regulatory standpoint, so what does your research suggest about future regulations for data breaches, and what is what you've found to be effective or found not to be effective?
Okay. So I think the most important thing is that organizations need to be nudged, if not mandated, to be more proactive with the notifications. And not just with high-risk ones, but also with any breach that occurs, because it has been shown that in court it's often unclear how high risk a breach actually is. And so it makes sense to just notify customers whenever there is a breach. And overall, get organizations to take more responsibility there and take creative approaches to help raise awareness about the breaches that occur.
Thank you, Peter. And I wanted to thank all of our panelists, Peter, Cameron, Nico, and Siddhant today for presenting this research. I think it is all very interesting and novel research on this issue of privacy notices and data breaches, which has been addressed before. These are new and different and innovative ways to explore them, and hopefully will be something that you and others build on in the future.